I'm Edwin Warfield, the publisher of City Biz, and I'm honored today to interview Elizabeth Bonner, who is the Vice President of Unite Mount Vernon. Welcome, Elizabeth.
I'm very glad to be here, Edwin. Thank you for having me.
Agora was founded in 1978 and became a major presence in Baltimore by the early 1980s. When did you first join the organization, and what role did you play in the early growth and direction?
Well, 1978 coincided with my graduation from Harvard, and I was looking for something interesting and challenging to do. I had studied literature, always interested in publishing. And so a mutual friend of Bill Bonner and myself suggested I might like to be an intern there. So I did that, and I interned at a few other places, and then they offered me a full-time job. And I plunged in about 1980 and I was given a magazine to edit. And of course, the magazine was sort of sliding down off a cliff because neither Bill Bonner nor his partner knew anything about publishing. They were just two very bright young guys who had been very successful at direct mail and very literary turn of mind. And so I turned it around by writing all the articles, interviewing authors, and doing mock up and layout. And I learned all the tools of the trade in those ancient days. So that's how I got started. And I was drawn into this triumvirate and loved it, and loved the independence and the freedom to develop that it gave me. And I guess, I brought a lot of energy and willingness to learn into that group.
So Agora relocated to Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood in 1982 at the time when the city was encouraging reinvestment through Mayor Schaefer's Dollar House program. What was the,
Well, yeah.
go ahead.
Well, just a little correction. We came to Baltimore at that time, but not to Mount Vernon. Went into East Baltimore Street. We were near the Shot Tower. We bought two buildings for $200 apiece. The city provided very good financing. It was a very high interest rate environment then. And so that's where our first headquarters were, right next to Poupon Bakery, which is still there.
And so what was the first building you purchased in Mount Vernon?
So we purchased the first building we purchased, we needed to expand, and we bought 14 West Mount Vernon Place in 1993 and moved our company into that. That's how small we were then. And then we just continued expanding, growing, and now own several uh, former private houses that had been turned into various offices in Mount Vernon.
Can you share some of the history of Mount Vernon, the Howard family? And yeah, you have a vast reservoir of the history of Mount Vernon. Can you share some of that?
Yeah. So Mount Vernon, begin in the beginning, it was part of a very large estate that belonged to John Eager Howard, who was a hero of the American Revolution, as you know, and he was a Marylander and very proud of what he had done for his country. And so he proposed building the first monument to George Washington and donated the land. And that monument still stands and is surrounded by four parks that were landscaped later in the early 19th century. He donated the land, and it remained fields, farmland, woods, and was actually part of it was called Howard's Woods. And it was his sons who decided that as the city was expanding, growing, becoming more rich, that this would be a good place to develop property. So they divided it into lots, and one of the first buildings built there was in 1838. It was a long time ago, and you can see it in a painting that's at the Maryland Historical Society. There's a monument. There happened to be a lot of troops bivouacked all around it because there are no parks or anything, no square at that time. And there is this mansion that sits in great splendor off to the west. That building is still there, and it is next to one of Agora's buildings that was built later. There were a few scattered buildings like that. Well, not even, they were big private houses that were really out in the country at that time. And the other one was one of the Carroll mansions, or really, it was a Howard mansion, although the two families, as anybody who knows Maryland history is aware, were very tightly connected. But it belonged to one of John Howard's sons, and he built it right next to the monument, a great big wide house. And then in the 1840s, Mount Vernon really took off, and everybody who was wealthy and well connected and wanted to be in a fashionable spot started building big Greek revival houses. And it was the period right after the revolution when Americans felt very akin to the Democrats of Greece and to the Republicans of Rome, the early part of the Roman story before it became a decadent empire and was governed by its sort of wealthiest and wisest citizens. It's how they saw themselves. And they built houses all around the squares that often had uh, Greek columns or Roman columns. And then as time went on, and particularly after the Civil War, Baltimore became even richer. And the mood of the country probably began to change, and the mood of Baltimoreans changed, and they became enchanted with Europe, which now they had a chance to visit, becoming wealthy and well connected to the noble houses of Europe because they considered they were, the up and coming nation, and that was their place to be. And one of those stories, of course, is Betsy Bonaparte marrying the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. But starting in about the late 1860s, they transformed these more sober Greek revival houses, neoclassical houses, into sort of Italian merchant palaces. And so that's where you see 14 West Mount Vernon Place is actually even a later edition of that. It's a French Beaux-Arts chateau palace set in Baltimore City. And you see a wonderful melange of Baltimore's architecture in Mount Vernon, which you don't really see in any other city, partly because Baltimore, after becoming one of the very wealthiest places in the new United States, with its wonderful transportation out to the west, the canals, the railroads, our banking, our insurance companies, our dry goods companies, it subsided into being secondary to New York and even to Philadelphia. And so it didn't change very much. And that is a wonderful thing because today you can walk all around Mount Vernon, and particularly around Mount Vernon Square, and you can see houses from the very early times. There are even some federal houses tucked away. You can see that building from 1838 is still there, and the buildings from the 1840s that extolled the virtues of classical simplicity and noble virtues are still there, and the houses that imitated the Renaissance palaces of Florence are still there, and the buildings that were inspired by the Beaux-Arts movement in Paris. They're all still there, and it's a wonderful, unique urban space in the United States. So there's a little
That's
tap up.
a couple centuries. Agora has become known for restoring and repurposing many other landmark buildings in Mount Vernon.
Yeah,
702 Cathedral, 1227 St. Paul. Can you highlight some of the other buildings that Agora has purchased and their sort of
yeah,
historic significance?
yeah. Well, starting with 14 West was a house built in the 1840s for the Smalls and was bought by Theodore Marburg in the 1870s. And he's a very prominent person, was a very prominent person at the time, and was prominent internationally because he helped found the League of Nations, precursor to the United Nations. He founded the Municipal Arts Society, which promoted the City Beautiful movement in Baltimore, one of the very first to do so, and started the urban preservation movement in the United States. So we own that building. Of course, 1217 is a fabulous building, as anybody who's walked past it has seen. That's 1217 St. Paul. It's known as the Winans Mansion, and that building was constructed by Stanford White, one of the preeminent architects of the U.S. and in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and all the money that had been made in railroads poured into that building. And that also is a not just a United States link to American history, but his father, Ross Winans' father, had established the family in Russia under the Tsars and were building railroads through Russia. And there's a branch of the family that remained there and through the revolution. And then I guess they fled to Paris like everybody else. So those are two very remarkable buildings. At 702, which you mentioned, 702 Cathedral, which was transformed actually as late as the 1950s into the Christian Science Building and given a very different kind of front than you see anywhere else. It corresponds to the virtues of extolled by Christian scientists of kind of scientific rigor with its triangular pediment and sober facade. That is a building where President Lincoln spent the night while visiting the Alberts. And the Albert family, I am told, by one of the Alberts, still has the bed in which the president slept. 105 West Monument, which is not far from the squares and is one of our buildings, had been at one time a boarding house, and it was a favorite place for the Booths to stay because they were actors, and actors needed a place, to sleep between giving their plays. So it has we have buildings that have a lot of very interesting history to them, and some of them will be on display at the House and Garden tour on the 25th, just to throw in a little mention for them.
So you've been involved with Unite Mount Vernon, which is playing a key role in strengthening the community. Can you introduce us to Unite Mount Vernon and describe your role in its mission?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Mount Vernon. Unite Mount Vernon was formed. The the impetus to forming it, when we formed it, was because we needed an instrument to save the United Methodist Church on Mount Vernon Place. And that's that big green church which all Baltimoreans know and which a lot of out of towners come to visit, or at least to photograph, because until very recently you couldn't go inside. It had been closed down for about a decade and used very sparingly by the Methodist Church. So that had been for sale for several years, no taker of any plausibility, but a very difficult situation with a contract that blocked all other takers. And we realized that we couldn't just kind of hope that somebody was going to come along and find a good purpose for that building and preserve it, but we were going to have to step up and do it ourselves. So that is the purpose of Unite Mount Vernon, was specifically to provide a home for the United Methodist Church, the Mount Vernon Place Church, as we call it now. But it is also to be a development arm for Mount Vernon. We don't have an official development arm, where there are a lot of developers in Mount Vernon, and I am one of them, and so is Agora in its way. But there is no entity that looks at problem buildings or an ensemble of buildings, if you like, and says, this we need to preserve because it is an essential part of the fabric of this civic space. And that's really why it was formed. It begins with the church, the Green Church, but we intend for it to develop further. And I got involved because I happened to be renovating a building on the across from the Peabody, and the person who was interested in who had a contract to buy the church and Asbury House, the rectory next to it, approached my contractor. My contractor said, "Oh, there's a guy that wants to sell you a church up the street." And I thought we had actually looked at it for Agora, because initially the Methodist Conference, which owned the building, thought that Agora would be a good owner for it, but it wasn't at all practical for us. And we're not really in the business of tearing things apart and reconstituting them as an office. We take buildings that have already been turned into offices, and we use them that way, in a way that we think is sensitive to the architecture. But anyhow, so I was intrigued, and I was very interested in the rectory because I thought now I can handle that. Um, and I kept sort of in touch with the person that wanted to sell it to me. And that was in 2020, and he got me to make him an offer, which was insane. So the next day I woke up and thought, I'm not doing that. And he was like Rumpelstiltskin. He stamped his foot, and then he said, well, what do you want to pay? And it was still too much. So then, then the pandemic came, and we didn't have to do anything, and that was probably the best thing. And then, you know, back in business, 21, 22, I realized this is not something for me to do. We need to involve others. Others were interested. So with Jack Dana, who's the president of the Mount Vernon um, Belvedere Midtown Association, we decided we were going to form this entity. And we drew in Henry Hopkins, who is not only a very well known person in Baltimore as a philanthropist and was the lead lawyer for T. Rowe Price, but also was the person who's behind the founding of and funding of the restoration, well, of the Mount Vernon Place Conservancy, which restored the George Washington Monument about 10 years ago. So Henry very interested in what we were trying to do and seeing how important it was for the conservancy and the restoration and preservation of the four parks around the monument, said he would be our treasurer. And then we found another person, Ann Powell, another neighborhood, a resident of the neighborhood who is an architect and has worked a great deal in historic preservation and managed large, complex jobs, and is also on the board of Preservation Maryland. So then we had our nucleus, and we approached Preservation Maryland to be our fiscal sponsor because it takes a while, as anybody knows, to become a recognized entity with the IRS and be able to accept a donation like the church. And then meanwhile, I had been going back and forth with the conference leadership and trying to, they were a lot more understanding than the person before, but it was still hard to work something out. And eventually, various series of events, they were freed of an old contract that they had and were able to negotiate directly with Unite and with me. And so we arrived at a price, and we had the funds and were able to acquire it. And that was last summer. So we have been going ever since.
So preservation seems to be central to Agora's philosophy.
Yeah.
Give the history of that and Bill's role in that. And you left Agora a while ago. Is
Yeah,
that
I left Agora. I had a short, I hope it was a glorious career, but it was relatively short. I married Bill Bonner and we have four children. And so that was a very full-time occupation for me. And I then we lived in Reservoir Hill and I started doing historic renovation there. And that totally occupied me. My husband is really a Renaissance man and is interested in a lot of things and might have been a builder if he hadn't become a publisher, is a wonderful writer, as many know. And he is just interested in historic buildings and historic preservation. And it's something that in our private life we've done a lot of. We started out in Reservoir Hill with our own house, and we moved to France in the 1990s, really right after we bought 14 West, moved to London, and then a couple of years later moved to France, where we lived for 15 years, and we restored a chateau and then another one. And so he likes to work with his hands, and he has a deep appreciation for, as the French say, les vieilles pierres, old stones. So he did not try to stop me when I told him about this church. He was very supportive of it. And I guess it ties in with Agora's philosophy. We're have had various centers of interest. We do a travel publication, or really an international lifestyle publication called International Living, which was one of our very first publications. And we have a great many investment publications that help individuals invest their money or and understand the greater economy and what's going on in the world today and try to help them establish financial security. And I think that goes together with an interest in continuity and preserving things from the past for future generations is very much our message.
So, looking ahead, what is your vision for Mount Vernon over the next 10 to 20 years, and what role will the Agora play in that?
Well, I certainly think Agora is committed to Mount Vernon and has had many opportunities, especially during the pandemic, to kind of close up shop and go somewhere maybe easier. And at the time, what seemed maybe more attractive to a lot of our employees. But curiously enough, now it's 6 years past the pandemic and people are starting to come back to work a lot more. And I think starting to see the value of being in a place. And they like our old buildings. They're favorites. We also own the Monumental Life 1967 Tower, which we totally redid as a modern office building, and the people there love it. But a lot of people want to work at 1217 St. Paul Street or 14 West Monument Street. And of course, the Oxford Club has never left 105. I mean, these buildings and Mount Vernon itself give you a feeling of place, and they give it an identity to where you spend your workday. And I think they give our company a special identity, and that's important. It's important for people who work somewhere to feel like it kind of matters, and it's not just a cubicle that could be anywhere. It's somewhere. It's someplace. And so Agora is committed to staying in Mount Vernon and maintaining its buildings and having its employees return to work as much as we can in that place. And we are very committed too to trying to support the commercial life of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon, in my vision, and I think shared by pretty much everybody, is for Mount Vernon to become more of a residential and small office community where you can walk everywhere and where we would like to see the through traffic that comes, goes out St. Paul and comes down Charles and, mobs North Calvert Street. We'd like to see that rooted around. I mean, we don't want to inconvenience anybody, but I think it is time in Baltimore, as in many other cities, to recognize that if people are going to come back and live in cities, they cannot feel as if they're walking along a mini highway. And people will not live in places that don't feel like a place you should live. They will live there for a short time, but they won't commit to it as a place, as their place. And I think that is what my vision is. I'd like to see more green space in Mount Vernon. I'd like to see, if some building is going to be torn down that the city doesn't need anymore, that we have more park. And I know that requires maintenance, it requires commitment, but I do think it's very important. And I'd like to see more little shops and cafes and all the things that make Mount Vernon already a very pleasant place develop further.
So, Elizabeth, is there any part of your story or the Agora story that you haven't shared with us that you'd like to share with us as we finish this?
I don't know. You have to ask me a question about that. I
You know,
mean,
yeah. So anything that we've missed in the story?
oh, gosh, I don't know. I mean, Agora is a very wide-ranging kind of company, and the people who founded it, and I would include myself, even though I'm really in a supporting role rather than directly involved, have that mindset. We're not just, dollars and cents, although we are constantly reminded by the market that that's what it's about, and you can't lose sight of it. But we're interested in ideas, and that is why we're in Mount Vernon. We're interested in the life of the mind and in a life that is more, in a business that's more than just kind of doing something that works for a while and then figuring out the next step from there.
Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for your time. Yeah, the Agora's impact not only in Mount Vernon, but as you said, Nicaragua,
Well,
is significant, and I think your contribution to Baltimore and Mount Vernon is important, and we
well,
appreciate your ongoing commitment to the city.
Well, we appreciate your interest in, I appreciate your interest in talking to me, and I urge everybody to take a second look at Mount Vernon and at Baltimore City. And you know, I guess if we can all pull together, this is going to be better and better.
I want to thank you for your time. It's enjoyed the.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Edwin.